I wanted to bring to you guys the Geraldo Rivera special investigation into Elvis's death. In case you've never seen it before, and we'll have a conversation about this, please let me know what you think. Is it controversial still?
Buying his records, seeing his movies. 2 days ago, the news came from Nashville of a charge against Elvis Presley's personal physician, accused by the Tennessee State Board of Medical Examiners of indiscriminately prescribing uppers, downers, and pain-killing drugs that Elvis Presley consumed in large quantities. For months, Geraldo Rivera has been investigating this story, and because of its startling nature, we're devoting our entire hour tonight to Geraldo Rivera's special 2020 report on the man known as the king of rock and roll. Geraldo.
Thank you, the king he was. Elvis Presley was a giant on America's cultural landscape, a man filled with passion and fire at a time when most of the rest of the country was sleepwalking through its cultural life. He didn't invent rock and roll, he just hand-carried it into the mainstream. Elvis Presley was different, and because he was good at it, it paid off. All 28 of his movies were moneymakers, and his records have sold somewhere between 700 and 800 million copies. That works out to roughly one Elvis Presley record for each family on the face of the earth. Despite the fact that hundreds of thousands of people worshipped him, the king demonstrated the fact of his mortality when he died at the age of 42. They told us of a heart attack. But did Elvis Presley really die of a heart attack? That's what this special edition of 2020 is all about.
The police came out and they filmed the show, so I couldn't move. I had to stand still. The only thing I moved was my little finger like that.
He was, of course, the first and greatest of the world's rock stars, and his death shocked the nation. The working-class hero, the hillbilly cat, was dead. And 2 years later, hundreds of thousands still mourn his passing. Sensitive, sensual, generous, talented, he had been living proof that the rags-to-riches American dream could still come true. Since his death, that memory has been tainted slightly by a smoldering controversy. Did Elvis really die of a heart attack? Or was he just another victim of self-destructive overindulgence?
I don't think he had a heart attack. That's what I'd like to believe, that he died from a heart attack.
I know he had a hard life. It would make no difference.
Everybody should be told the truth.
I've been thinking about that. I hope and pray that he didn't do it on purpose.
We know that at the time of his death, Elvis was no longer the slim, swivel-hip sex symbol he once was. As this videotape of his last concert clearly shows, by June of '77, 2 months before he died, Elvis seemed strained and swollen. But despite his apparent physical condition, he could still thrill his audience with the power of his voice and the strength of his personality.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to say hello to my girlfriend, Ginger. Ginger, stand up, honey. Sit down, Ginger. It's enough for her.
After Elvis died, were you told what he had died from?
Well, all of us had heard at the same time that it was a heart attack.
Do you believe in your own mind right now that that alone caused his death?
Right. In the very beginning, I did. I just, I think it was Elvis's time to go. So I think he took him. But then again, in my mind, there are a lot of unanswered questions.
Our investigation of the death begins with a reconstruction of the last 12 hours of Elvis Presley's life. Like many people in show business, he and his entourage were night owls. Their days began after dark. About an hour before midnight on the night before he died, Elvis had a dentist appointment with a dentist named Lester Hoffman. Accompanied by his fiancée Ginger Alden, his cousin Billy Smith, and longtime friend Charlie Hodge, Elvis drove out of Graceland, his famous home in Memphis, Tennessee. The next day, August 16th, was the scheduled beginning of another concert tour, and Elvis wanted to get his teeth cleaned and 2 fillings replaced before he went out on the road.
We returned back to Graceland at about 1:30, and Elvis and I went upstairs, and Elvis turned on the television in his room to relax for a little while. Then Elvis started talking about his tour and started talking about our wedding plans and about announcing our engagement at his Memphis concert.
All right, so does anybody truly believe that Elvis did ask Ginger that night to marry him still? Let me know in the comments.
Then it was about 4 o'clock, and I asked Elvis if he still wanted to play racquetball, which he had mentioned playing earlier, and he said yes. Elvis got in touch with Billy Smith, and Billy and his wife Jo came up at about 4:30. We went down to play racquetball. So Elvis really seemed like he was in a good mood. He played racquetball for a little while and then went and played the piano. It was about 6 o'clock when we went back into Graceland. At about 6:30, Elvis called downstairs for Ricky Stanley to bring up his packet of medication to help him get to sleep because he was so nervous about, he was always kind of keyed up before starting a tour. So Ricky brought it up. Elvis took his packet of medication and started reading a book on psychic energy then. He thought that would help him fall asleep. Then I fell asleep. So at about 8 o'clock, I woke up because Elvis was restless, saying that he just couldn't sleep. So he called downstairs for Ricky again, and Ricky came up and brought up another packet of medication.
A second packet.
Right. Elvis took that, and then I went back to sleep. The third time I was awakened again, Elvis was starting to get up, saying that he still couldn't sleep. He took the book on psychic energy with him, and he started toward the bathroom door. And I said, "No, don't fall asleep." And he turned and smiled at me and said, "Oh, okay, I won't." And then he went to the bathroom. I went back to sleep, and I slept until 2 o'clock. At that time, I rolled over and I looked at the clock, and it said 2 o'clock then, and the bathroom door was still shut. So at that time, I went in and I knocked on the door, and no one answered. So I opened the door, and that was when I saw Elvis.
According to an investigator for the medical examiner's office, the body was purple or deep blue, and rigor mortis had already set in. Elvis had apparently been dead since early that morning. After a flurry of desperate activity, which may have included attempts at mouth-to-mouth resuscitation by members of the Presley staff, an ambulance arrived at Graceland. 2 paramedics from the Memphis Fire Department, Ulysses Jones and Charles Crosby, needed assistance from several of the aides even to lift Elvis onto their stretcher. He weighed between 250 and 255 pounds. The body was rushed to the Baptist Memorial Hospital, where an emergency resuscitation team, similar to the one shown here, worked in vain to revive Elvis. In a very short time, it became apparent the effort was useless. Even at that time, the authorities at least suspected that the death might be drug-related. Dan Warlick, the investigator from the medical examiner's office, received the news of the death from the police. The message to him read, EPOD DOA BMH. Elvis Presley, overdose ? Dead on arrival, Baptist Memorial Hospital. At about 3:30 in the afternoon Central Time, on August 16, 1977, Elvis Aaron Presley, age 42, was officially pronounced dead. It was the lead story on the evening's news broadcasts.
It may have been a heart attack, but police in Memphis, Tennessee are also investigating the possibility that Elvis Presley's death this afternoon was caused by a drug overdose. Presley was found unconscious in his mansion at about 2:30, was pronounced dead an hour later.
Since the crowds had already begun gathering outside Baptist Hospital, the doctors decided to perform the autopsy there, rather than risk transporting the body to the morgue in the city hospital across the street. The autopsy was performed by approximately 8 doctors on the staff of Baptist Hospital, and it was, in their words, the most painstakingly complete autopsy they had ever done. Item: ABC News has learned that no immediate discovery was made of any disease or injury which could have caused Elvis's death. His heart was indeed enlarged and muscular, and there was significant blockage of the arteries. But according to 2 doctors present at the autopsy, serious heart disease was still years away for Elvis Presley. The doctors therefore decided they would tell the waiting world that Elvis had died from, quote, unknown causes, and that the investigation was continuing. But apparently acting on his own initiative, the county medical examiner, Dr. Jerry T. Francisco, who had been present at the autopsy, went before the cameras and told a much different story. Without the advice or consent from the doctors from Baptist Hospital, who had actually performed the autopsy, Dr. Francisco told the waiting world that Elvis Presley had died of a heart attack.
Results of the autopsy are that the cause of death is a cardiac arrhythmia due to undetermined causes. There are several cardiovascular diseases that are known to be present. One is a mild degree of hypertension that had been under treatment for some time, and that there was hardening of the arteries, the coronary arteries of the heart, known as coronary atherosclerosis.
To the millions of people who knew the man and his music and loved it, people like me, Dr. Francisco's announcement brought almost a sigh of relief. Elvis Presley was dead, but while that was terrible, at least he had died of natural causes. At least the king had not followed in the melancholy rock and roll tradition of Janis Joplin, Jim Morrison, Jimi Hendrix, and all the others. But did Elvis really die of a heart attack? Sometimes the truth hurts. Our investigation indicates he did not. We'll tell you the real story of how and why he died after this.
Shocked and saddened millions of Elvis fans. The public was told that his death was caused by heart attack. But almost from the moment he died, rumors...
Now, there's no doubt that Geraldo talked to Priscilla Presley as well. That's why Priscilla is kind of in the subject line of this video. Did Priscilla feed Geraldo information? What do you think about that?
Geraldo, it seems that you may have located the key to the mystery.
The key to the mystery is the Shelby County medical examiner, Dr. Jerry T. Francisco, and if we had his help, we could have cracked this case months ago, but we did not. He consistently refused to be interviewed by us. Claiming that the information is confidential, he has also refused to make public the autopsy results that would lay to rest once and forever the controversy over how and why Elvis Presley died. In order to obtain those results, we filed a lawsuit against Dr. Francisco, the medical examiner. Our motives are simple. Based on the evidence you're about to see, we believe there's been a cover-up. Item. As far as we can determine, no member of the staff of Baptist Hospital, including Dr. Eric Muirhead, the internationally known pathologist who headed the autopsy team, has ever agreed with Dr. Francisco, the medical examiner's conclusions. They have never said that Elvis died of natural causes. Maurice Elliott, spokesman for Baptist Hospital.
We never confirmed them, and we were not able to disagree with them either because of the fact that we are required to maintain the confidentiality of these records as a private patient as they now stand.
Leading inevitably, Mr. Elliott, to speculation that the staff of Baptist Hospital arrived at a different conclusion than the staff of the medical examiner's office.
Well, yes, obviously that speculation does exist, but there's just no way we can comment on it or put it to rest, really, and still maintain our obligation to respect the confidentiality or to maintain the confidentiality of the information.
But there is one doctor who was present at the autopsy who did consent to talk with us on the record. His name is Noel Florendo, and he was an assistant to Dr. Muirhead. Dr. Florendo was called in on the autopsy because he's an expert in the use of the electron microscope. Working now at another hospital in Memphis, Dr. Florendo had the courage to tell us what really happened in the autopsy room. Remember, Dr. Francisco is the Shelby County medical examiner who announced Elvis had died of a heart attack, but Dr. Muirhead is the man who actually supervised the autopsy. Dr. Florendo, in your medical judgment, was there any evidence that Elvis Presley died of a heart attack?
From what I saw grossly and from what my limited judgment was at that particular time, there was no gross evidence of a heart attack.
There was no gross evidence of a heart attack?
No gross evidence of a heart attack.
Were you surprised by Dr. Francisco's announcement that he had died of cardiac arrhythmia?
Personally, yes, I was surprised.
What is cardiac arrhythmia?
Cardiac arrhythmia, best explained, is an irregularity in the heartbeat sufficiently irregular enough to cause death.
And in Elvis Presley's case?
I could not find any morphological evidence of that, and indeed, I do not think there is any morphological evidence grossly to substantiate cardiac arrhythmia.
So in your opinion, he did not die of a heart attack?
In my opinion, I did not see any evidence of a heart attack morphologically.
Morphologically meaning?
Meaning there was no gross evidence of a heart attack.
I understand that you agree with Dr. Muirhead's conclusions.
Yes, I agree with Dr. Muirhead's conclusions.
And those conclusions being?
Polypharmacy.
That Elvis Presley died of the interaction of several drugs.
Most probably, yes.
Despite the contention by many officials in Memphis that Elvis Presley died of, quote, natural causes.
At the time, everybody was saying heart attack and there was no drugs involved, even prescription drugs. That being said, Geraldo was just looking to smear Elvis Presley.
Called in to help analyze the Presley autopsy. Their findings are depressing. According to those findings, at the time of his death, Elvis Presley was apparently abusing many different drugs. Bioscience was called in because it has some of the most advanced and sophisticated equipment available anywhere in the country. For almost 2 months, its technicians carefully analyzed the tissue samples for the autopsy being prepared in Memphis. ABC News obtained a copy of the bioscience test results. The data revealed the following narcotic drugs in the body of Elvis Aaron Presley: codeine, morphine, methaqualone, also known as Quaaludes, Valium, Valmid, Placidil, Nembutal, phenobarbital, pentobarbital, and butabarbital. All of them are so-called downers, central nervous system depressants. Usually taken to bring on relaxation and sleep, the drugs are often abused. Several are addictive. The list of drugs found in Elvis Presley's body is certainly shocking enough. But in all likelihood, even that doesn't represent the whole extent of his drug abuse problem. ABC News has learned that shortly after Elvis's body was brought here to Baptist Memorial Hospital, the contents of his stomach were pumped out. And although the contents of the stomach are generally considered of vital importance in pinpointing the cause of death, they were destroyed in this case, without ever having been analyzed. Given all we know now about Elvis Presley's drug abuse problem, it's reasonable to assume that vital evidence was therefore destroyed. Evidence of whatever drugs Elvis had taken shortly before he died. What we've so far been unable to determine is whether that evidence was destroyed intentionally or merely through neglect. In October of 1977, 2 months after Elvis was found dead in his bathroom at Graceland, word of the drugs found began leaking to the newspapers in Memphis. To quiet the spreading rumors, Dr. Jerry T. Francisco held another press conference.
Shelby County Medical Examiner Dr. Jerry Francisco told reporters that the conclusion of his 2-month autopsy into the death of Elvis Presley is that the entertainer died of a heart attack and that drugs were not a contributing factor.
The cause of death has been ascribed to hypertensive heart disease and coronary artery heart disease as a contributory factor.
Dr. Raymond Kelly of Bioscience.
When we undertake to do this sort of analysis, we do it in the most thorough and conclusive way as we possibly can. And we don't rush ourselves. We utilize every analytical technique we have available, and that includes some of the most sophisticated methods anywhere in the country.
What about in a case with medical legal implications?
We exercise more care in that sort of analysis than anything else that we do because it has potential legal significance.
How about the Elvis Presley case, specifically? How was that treated here?
Well, that's the most important medical legal case we've ever had. And so we, if anything, exercised even more care in the analysis of those specimens than we would normally exercise.
This is all just a prime example of everybody trying to get rich and famous off of Elvis Presley's passing.
The results found here at Bioscience could be discounted.
That doesn't seem reasonable to me at all. I think that a person making that statement just couldn't be familiar with the way that we approach these kind of samples.
As you know, Doctor, we have obtained by independent means a chart, a table that lists the drugs that were present in Mr. Presley's body at the time of death. How sure are you that those numbers accurately represent the levels found in Mr. Presley's body at the time of death?
I'm sure beyond a reasonable doubt.
The findings of bioscience were confirmed and amplified by both the other outside laboratories, the Orange County Coroner's Office and the University of Utah Center for Human Toxicology. After we verified the authenticity of the report, we took the raw data to a Los Angeles doctor, Matthew Ellenhorn. We asked him to analyze and review the data thoroughly. Ellenhorn's an expert in medical malpractice and a certified toxicologist. We asked him for the real cause of death.
Cause of death was an overdose of codeine and an overdose of methaqualone or Quaalude. And that was contributed to by a presence in the bloodstream which indicated that the patient had taken, probably within the previous 24 hours, at least 5 additional drugs known to produce depression of the central nervous system, of depression of the brain.
To be certain, we asked for a second expert opinion. We provided the data to Dr. Cyril Wecht, the coroner for Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, for analysis. Dr. Wecht is one of the foremost medical examiners in the entire country.
I believe that Mr. Presley died as a result of a combined drug effect, various drugs, all of which are known to be central nervous system depressants, collectively cause the heart and lung to be depressed. The brain controls the activities of the heart and lung involuntarily. And when the brain is depressed by multiple drugs, such as happened in this case, in my opinion, the heart and lungs will not function properly.
What drugs specifically are we referring to, Doctor?
There were several drugs involved here. The principal offender in this case was codeine, which is a pain reliever, but which is known to have a CNS depressant effect. Other drugs included Valium, a tranquilizer, Valmid, a sedative, Placidil, a sedative, phenobarbital, a sedative, and butabarbital, a sedative. It's incredible, really, that all these drugs should have been given to the patient simultaneously. There was one other drug involved, methaqualone, which is a tranquilizer.
Knowing now about the laundry list of drugs, our investigative team decided to track down some of the people who knew Elvis best. David Stanley was his stepbrother. David also worked at Graceland as a security man and personal aide to Elvis.
Listen to me, David. This is very important. You personally witnessed Elvis Presley abusing drugs on many, many occasions, almost daily.
3 times a week. I'd work a day, Ricky'd work a day, 2 other guys would work. So I'd about 2 to 3 times a week.
But every time you were on duty?
Every time.
Every single time?
Every day. Every day. Last 2 years of Elvis's life, it was every day.
What would Elvis do if he didn't get the drugs he wanted?
He'd get upset sometimes. We were in Vegas one time, and like we were there for like 8 weeks, you know, and Elvis was getting his drugs, but it got to a point to where his doctor wanted to shut him off in Vegas. And we couldn't reach the doctor anymore. So he jumped up on the table one day and he pulled out his .45 and he says, "I'll buy a goddamn drugstore if I have to." He says, "I'm gonna get what I want." He says, "You people better realize that either you're with me or against me. Either you take it or I'll buy your plane ticket home."
Why didn't you stop him?
I tried on different occasions to stop Elvis. When I saw him take something that I thought he shouldn't be taking or taking too much of something. And on the different times he would say, I don't understand. But he would, he would say, "I need it," which I don't understand. And when I first started dating Elvis, I just turned 20 at the time. And no one ever told me anything about what to expect, how the group was, or anything like that. I had to learn everything on my own. And the people that had been around Elvis for all these years, when I saw Elvis take something, which was mainly before he would go to sleep, I thought to myself, well, it must not really be harmful if it's prescribed. And if these people over the years, if Elvis is still doing it, then it must not really be very harmful for him.
Elvis had a serious drug problem. Geraldo was very serious. The reason I can say is because I used to have a drug problem, we've discussed. And
I would say it was very, very bad, and we knew if it continued that something like this would happen. We knew it would just be a matter of time.
Rick Stanley, another of Elvis's stepbrothers, was working at Graceland on the night Elvis died. Were you the person who filled the prescription at Baptist Memorial?
Yes, I was.
What was it?
It was Dilaudid.
Dilaudid, a very powerful morphine-type drug.
Class A narcotic.
Then what did you do with it?
Well, I went back to Elvis's house, went upstairs, and gave it to him. Talked with him for a moment, and left.
Who signed that prescription?
Dr. Nicopoulos.
What was in the second packet that you brought upstairs?
In the second packet were varieties of sleeping pills, Quaalude, some barbiturates, Seconal, Tuinals, Amitol, Valium, and a couple of Demerol tabs.
Approximately how many pills?
6 to 8 pills.
Was that common?
Yes, it was.
Did it happen every night that you were on duty?
Oh, yeah. Every night I was on duty. Elvis couldn't sleep without it.
So you definitely have Ginger being paid for this, or just for the fame of it, to talk about how she was just too young to deal with it. And then, of course, not Billy Stanley, but his brother, who was basically saying Elvis had a major, major problem with drugs. And, of course, you know, I mean, if you love somebody, you don't disparage them. You know, let them think what they want to think, but don't share that stuff, is my opinion.
No real medical need for the drug. Mr. Nash, the druggist, is now retired and living in Kentucky, but he's still pained by the memory of Elvis's last prescription.
I pictured myself as a person dispensing the fatal dose that killed him, even though that the possibility is that had that been the only drug he had taken, it probably wouldn't have killed him. But in combination with others, I'm almost sure it did.
As indeed it did. At this point in the story, there's something very important to be added. Elvis Presley was certainly no street addict. The drugs which destroyed his world and which finally killed him were all prescription medicine. He got the codeine from his dentist, the morphine and the Quaaludes from his doctor. The drugs were all legal medicine prescribed by licensed doctors and dentists. That last prescription, for instance, the morphine, was written by a man named Dr. George Nicopoulos. Dr. Nick, as he was called at Graceland, had been a close friend and a member of Elvis's so-called Memphis Mafia since 1966. I'll have a lot to say about Dr. Nick and about some of the other doctors who wrote some of the other prescriptions when 2020 returns after this. Cover-Up is a special 2020 investigation of the facts and circumstances surrounding the death of Elvis Presley. When the program continues, we'll be meeting the licensed doctors who provided Elvis with the legal medicine that killed him, the doctors, and the role they played in the bizarre life and unnecessary death of Elvis Presley. When 2020 continues in a moment.
Tonight, 2020 is presenting the results of an investigation by Geraldo Rivera into the death of Elvis Presley. We've established that Elvis Presley was dependent on drugs prescribed by his own doctors, doctors who were supposed to help him.
The doctors that wrote the prescriptions, in my opinion, contributed 70% of his early demise. I don't think anybody should die at 42.
John O'Grady is a retired police officer who once headed the narcotics detail of the Los Angeles Police Department. Now a private detective, O'Grady frequently worked for Vernon Presley, Elvis's father, finding out who was supplying his son with drugs. There were several investigations between 1969 and 75, concerned primarily with Elvis's life on the West Coast. In your opinion, should his attending physicians have noticed the fact that he was abusing these drugs?
He'd either have to be a retarded alligator not to notice that, or a totally incompetent medical doctor.
In your opinion, did the doctors therefore contribute to Elvis Presley's death? Was Elvis Presley murdered, in a sense?
I think anyone that's abandoned and given something that causes their death for whatever reason is murder. Now, I'm not saying first degree, premeditated, but it's a degree of murder. It's negligence. There's negligent homicide. Could be the same thing. If you go to a bar and the bartender serves you 25 drinks in a row and you die there, somebody's guilty of your death. That's negligent homicide, which is another term is murder.
And you think the parallel to the Elvis Presley case is
very similar, except the bartender is a professional bartender, the doctor's a professional physician.
Jack Kelly, who once headed the Los Angeles office of the Drug Enforcement Administration, is now a private detective who worked with John O'Grady on the Elvis investigations.
He could get whatever he wanted anytime he wanted it. Most of them that I found were only too anxious to give it to him.
How so? Tell me a little bit more about that.
Well, for a variety of reasons. For one thing, you know, there's doctors who, through carelessness or irresponsibility, will get their patients addicted. And there's doctors who do it for monetary gain. And there are doctors, dentists, who do it because they're starstruck. You find that particularly out here in Hollywood. And unfortunately, Elvis was a victim of all three.
What about Max Shapiro?
Max Shapiro was a source of supply for Elvis, unquestionably.
You're sure of that?
Yes, I'm positive of it.
Dr. Max Shapiro, who asks everyone to call him Dr. Max, is at the very least a highly unusual dentist. Aside from the fact that he makes frequent house calls, the dentist also has the reputation in Hollywood of being a Dr. Feelgood, who makes his patients feel good by prescribing them narcotics, whether or not there's a medical need for the drugs.
How would you respond to being called a Dr. Feelgood?
Dr. Painless would be all right. But if I worked on a patient, they would never have pain. That was one of my very, very strong attitudes. I myself am afraid of pain. And I understand what a patient goes through. I've been lied to by doctors. They told me things wouldn't hurt. And they treated me, and it did hurt.
Did you make sure that Elvis suffered no pain?
Yes, of course. As all patients.
Outside the office after the interview, we decided to ask Dr. Max for just a quick glance inside the metal case he always carries with him on his so-called house calls. You wouldn't let me peek inside there, would you?
No, because I have narcotics in there now and things. So I don't like to have it open and displayed. I don't like people to even know where I keep things because I've been robbed.
But there are narcotics in there now.
Yes, there are narcotics in there now.
We did manage an earlier look inside Dr. Shapiro's case. It contained between 15 and 20 bottles of various narcotic drugs. There were no dental tools.
Do you ever hear of Dr. Shapiro, Max Shapiro, the dentist from Los Angeles?
Oh, yeah, I know who Max Shapiro is. I know him very well.
Were you ever physically present when he was giving drugs, passing drugs to Elvis?
I sure was all the time. And to me also.
Tell me about it.
Well, Max gave Elvis anything he wanted. He was like the rest of most of the doctors, just gave him any kind of medication he wanted, volunteered it.
Like what?
Well, barbiturates, some narcotics, amphetamines, things like that.
Quaaludes?
Oh, yeah, Quaaludes.
So what do we think about this? What do we think about this interview with David Stanley here?
Elvis was never a drug taker, and he never took drugs at all. The only thing he took was sleeping pills just to sleep, just like everybody else, I guess, in his field. But I've never known Elvis to take any hard drugs whatsoever.
While in Las Vegas, Elvis's principal doctor was Elias Ganem.
Now, Elias Ganem, was one of the doctors that Elvis did have treat him, and I really think that Elias really believed what he's saying here.
Speaking on the night Elvis died, Dr. Ganem told the interviewer that his famous patient did not abuse drugs, and certainly not drugs prescribed by him. Rick Stanley remembers it differently.
Well, Elias was no different than the rest. You know, Elias did the same thing. Now, I'll say, Elias, to me, seemed like he cared for Elvis. But, you know, after a while, he fell into it like the rest of them and just was giving him whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted.
Were there any doctors that said no to Elvis Presley?
Not that I know of. And I was around him for a long, long time. Not that I know of. Nobody hardly said no to Elvis Presley.
Dr. Ganem refused repeatedly to be interviewed by us. Elvis, of course, had many doctors over the years, but the doctor closest to him was a Memphis physician named George Nicopolis, known by the Presley entourage simply as Dr. Nick.
The records indicate that, especially in the last year of his life, you prescribed certain medications to Elvis Presley in quite extraordinarily large amounts. Why?
I can't comment on that, and I don't believe that it's true.
Well, the records we have, Doctor, and I'll say this as gently as I possibly can, indicate that from January 20th, 1977 until August 16th, 1977, the day he died, you prescribed to Elvis Presley, and the prescriptions are all signed by you, over 5,000 Schedule II narcotics and/or amphetamines. That comes out to something like 25 per day.
I don't believe that.
Well, is it something that you'd like to refresh your recollection on, or is it something that you deny?
I deny.
2 days ago, the state of Tennessee initiated proceedings to suspend or revoke Dr. Nick's license to practice medicine, principally because of the way he cared for Elvis Presley.
We have charged him with unprofessional conduct, gross incompetence, gross ignorance, gross negligence, and gross malpractice concerning his dispensing of narcotic substances. Specifically, we have charged him with dispensing, prescribing, and issuing narcotic and controlled substances not in good faith to relieve pain and not for a legitimate medical reason.
Who was the patient?
Well, there were 16 different patients we have charged him with concerning these particular drugs we've talked about.
Is Elvis Presley?
Elvis Presley is one of these individuals.
Was his case the single most glaring case?
Without a doubt, Elvis Presley, from my experience, was issued more Schedule II uppers, downers, amphetamines than any other individual I have seen.
This is the worst case of overprescribing or of indiscriminate prescribing that I have ever seen in my time as an investigator with the state of Tennessee.
Elvis wasn't Dr. Nick's only patient in the entourage. Marty Lacker was Elvis's bookkeeper and the best man at his wedding to Priscilla. Medical authorities were told how Dr. Nick prescribed Lacker more than 13,000 pills in less than 4 years, an average of about 10 a day.
They just looked at the records and asked if I was alive, and he said yes. And asked if I was still taking them, and he said no. And asked how I got off them, and he said, well, he withdrew from, by himself. And so the next question they asked if I was in a mental institution. And he said no, thank God.
It was that bad, Marty?
Sure it was.
The state's complaint against Dr. Nicopolis lists 16 patients to whom Dr. Nick was allegedly overprescribing narcotic drugs, including performer Jerry Lee Lewis and Dr. Nick's own daughter, Chrissy. But the list of narcotic drugs he prescribed to Elvis Presley just during the last 7 months of Elvis's life is quite simply incredible, averaging about 25 narcotic pills a day.
Why would you prescribe that amount of drugs in that limited period of time?
I think you didn't understand me. I said, I don't think that I did.
You don't think that you did? Or
I know I did.
You absolutely stating that you did not?
Friendship was certainly one reason Nick gave Elvis what he wanted virtually whenever he wanted it. But there was another reason. Elvis and the entourage were Nick's main source of income, and ABC News has learned that Dr. Nick was in serious financial trouble in the months preceding Elvis's death. He was out on a financial limb because of his investment in this $5.5 million professional building. The building has been a financial flop. A quick tour indicates only about 1/3 occupancy. Nick also owed Elvis a lot of money. He'd borrowed $200,000 in 1975, and in March of 1977, Nick borrowed an additional $55,000 from his famous patient. Some of the money was used to finance Nick's elaborate Memphis home, and the records of the Presley estate indicate at least another $20,000 owed by Nick to Elvis.
May I ask one question?
No.
One general question. Do you have any regrets, sir?
No regrets.
Most of the prescriptions written by Nick were filled in a drugstore right across the street from his office. Jack Kirsch is the pharmacist who filled Elvis's prescriptions, totaling more than 5,300 pills in just 7 months. More than 600 pills on the day before Elvis died.
Yes, possibly in my own mind I would question this thing, but I never questioned the doctor.
In light of what happened to Elvis Presley, do you have any regrets?
I fill prescriptions. Yeah, I did not give the drugs to the patient. I gave the prescriptions to the doctor. No, I don't have any regrets.
You were just following orders?
I was following orders.
Only following orders. There are a lot of people who have a lot to answer for, and they will. We'll be back after this.
And the pen still writes. 1963, Bic shoots its pen from a rifle. The barrel shatters, but the pen still writes. Today, Bic is mounted on a jackhammer that slams into concrete with 1,200 foot-pounds of pressure, and it writes. For 20 years, Bic's been giving America its money's worth. The Bic pen, even when you treat it wrong, it writes. Now save on...
Geraldo Rivera with more on the Elvis cover-up.
The official investigation of the death of Elvis Presley, at least insofar as we've been able to determine, must rank among the worst, most unprofessional investigations of this type ever made. For whatever reason or motive, essentially no real effort was ever made to truly unearth the circumstances of Elvis Presley's death. It seems almost as if the city of Memphis itself just did not care to know the truth about the death of its most prominent citizen. Consider, if you will, the following points.
Item. No real police investigation was ever made. At 9 in the evening on the same day Elvis died, before it was medically or scientifically possible to know for sure why or how he had died, the Memphis police declared this case closed. Item. Dan Warlick was the man in charge of the medical examiner's investigation. Dr. Jerry T. Francisco, his boss, claimed Warlick had made an extensive search for drugs at Elvis's home, Graceland. In fact, Warlick admitted to us that he had never searched the house trailer of Graceland's resident nurse, the house trailer where all the drugs were kept. Item. Elvis's stomach contents were destroyed without ever having been analyzed. Item. There has never been a coroner's inquest. Item. The Shelby County District Attorney was never officially notified or asked to determine if there were any violations of criminal law. Item. No attempts were made, even after the toxicology reports were completed, to find out where Elvis had been getting all those drugs. Item. All the photographs taken of the death scene, all the notes of the medical examiner's investigator, and all of the toxicological reports allegedly prepared by the medical examiner are missing from the official files. Item. Officials of the county government believe there's been a cover-up.
The Elvis mystique completely pervades the Memphis area. And if there are individuals who are so concerned with the mystique that they do not care to know the truth, then I feel that somewhere along the way, someone has to take it upon himself to see that the truth is brought up.
But you definitely feel there's a cover-up?
I'm positive about that.
The question is not, did he die because his heart stopped? Of course he did, but why did his heart stop? Why did he have an irregular heartbeat? That's the question that needs to be determined and needs to be made available to the public.
Because Elvis Presley meant so much to so many people, it's easy to understand the desire to keep the best memories intact. But the public also has the right to know the truth, the right to know if we've been deceived, the right to make up our own mind. And regardless of the ultimate conclusions as to why he died, his death will never diminish or taint the enormous contributions he made during his life. He was one of a kind. He was a phenomenon. He was the king of rock and roll. Reporting this story has been a melancholy personal experience for me because I wanted it not to be true. For the last 2 years, I've made it a point to ignore the rumors of Elvis's drug abuse, and I even got angry at the people telling the stories, but they were right. It was true. By the end of his life, Elvis Presley had become a medical addict. The one positive thing about this report came this morning when the Attorney General of Memphis and Shelby County, Hugh Stanton, told us that finally, 2 years after the fact, he's going to conduct a criminal investigation of the death of Elvis Presley. A criminal investigation of the doctors who gave him the pills that killed him.
I do agree that, criminal investigations needed to be run on the doctors because, regardless of whether Elvis was getting medication for everybody or just himself, they needed to really not do that.
He did an early investigation and full disclosure.
And allowed these doctors to go on doing business as usual.
Right. Thank you, Geraldo. Next Thursday and on Thursdays to come, 2020 returns to its regular focus. We'll be bringing you a mix of stories on a wide range of subjects. We hope you'll be with us. Remember, we're in touch, so you be in touch. I'm Hugh Downs. Good night.
Then Michael Parks is a misfit cop.
I'm Hugh Downs, and this is 2020.
On the ABC News Magazine, 2020, tonight.
The terrible thing about the COINTEL program is it was deliberate lies.
This nation's federal police force, sworn to uphold the law, lied, broke the law, subverted justice in order to discredit tens of thousands of Americans, like actresses Jane Fonda and Jean Seberg, and civil rights leader Martin Luther King, and even a St. Louis housewife. In a frightening investigative report, Sylvia Chase exposes the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO.
She has dinner with me, and she goes to bed with me.
But when she's on, she belongs to everybody. She bounces, she jiggles, and in the top-rated Three's Company, she's a dumb blonde. Tonight, her story, from pinup to superstar. A Dave Marish profile. Suzanne Summers.
No, and there he goes again. Get out there and keep the volley firm.
Abuse, insult, rage, unrelenting pressure, and tennis. Tennis from dawn till dark. For this, parents pay Nick Bollettieri $12,000 a year and hope he'll make their kid a tennis champ. Tom Gerald reports on what it takes to make the best there is.
You prescribed to Elvis Presley, and the prescriptions are all signed by you.
The source, George Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, Elvis Presley's personal physician. Now, almost 3 years after Presley's death as a medical drug addict, Dr. Nick is indicted. Tonight, a 2020 follow-up report by Geraldo Rivera. The Indictment of Dr. Nick.
Tonight, these two men are facing charges of damaging government property. Now, 3 years after Presley's death, Dr. Nick is indicted. Coming up, a follow-up report by Geraldo Rivera, The Indictment of Dr. Nick. And she was in parochial development in the investigation of the death of Elvis Presley. It's been almost a year since we began the first independent investigation into the death of Elvis Presley, the king of rock and roll. We had no idea back then where the investigation would take us. Tonight we have a better picture. There's been an important development, an indictment. And here with a follow-up on his investigative reports on Presley's death is Geraldo Rivera.
Thank you. All we knew when we began this investigation was that many of the people closest to Elvis Presley simply did not believe he really died of a heart attack. Now, the first break in this story came when we obtained a report on the drugs found in Elvis's body at the time of his death. They were all prescription drugs, legal medicine. So we started looking for the licensed doctors who supplied Elvis whatever drug he wanted, whenever he wanted it.
Were there any doctors that said no to Elvis Presley?
Not that I know of. And I was around him for a long, long time. Not that I know of. Nobody hardly said no to Elvis Presley.
Our investigation uncovered willing doctors in Los Angeles and in Las Vegas. But it was in Elvis's hometown of Memphis that the evidence began pointing to Dr. George Nicopolis. Dr. Nick was Presley's personal physician on and off for 11 years. He was a member of the inner circle of the entourage that surrounded and helped isolate Elvis inside the walls of Graceland and under a mountain of prescription medicine.
You prescribed to Elvis Presley, and the prescriptions are all signed by you. Over 5,000 Schedule II narcotics and/or amphetamines. That comes out to something like 25 per day.
I don't believe that.
Well, is it something that you'd like to refresh your recollection on, or is it something that you deny?
I deny.
Last September's interview happened just days before the Tennessee Board of Medical Examiners began proceedings to revoke or suspend Dr. Nick's license to practice medicine. According to the board, the doctor had prescribed more than 12,000 narcotic pills and injections to Presley in just the last 20 months of his life. In his own defense, Dr. Nick explained how he cared for Elvis.
You can't imagine how big a nightmare this was for me. I mean, I tried to get psychiatric help. I tried to get him to go to sleep clinics. I tried to get him to get help from some other sources, and it was always either we'll do better or something. He just would not do it.
Two facts were confirmed during the week-long hearing. First, that Elvis had been a medical drug addict, hospitalized at least 3 times for detoxification. The second thing concerned Dr. Nick. It became clear that he led 2 lives. To most of his patients, he was a conscientious traditional family doctor. But to Elvis and to others who testified at the hearing, Dr. Nick was the source, the drug supplier.
So, Dr. Nicopolis, your license will be suspended for a period of 3 months, and the board will observe your activities in your practice for a period of 3 years.
Found guilty of 10 counts of overprescription, Dr. Nick's medical license was suspended for 3 months. He got off easily, but his legal problems were just beginning. A Shelby County grand jury began hearing testimony. Between February 20th and May 16th, 36 witnesses, most of them relatives, employees, and close friends of the late singer, pieced together the melancholy story of the last days of his life. Among the witnesses were Ginger Alden, who discovered his body on August 16th, 1977. Marty Lacker, best man in Presley's wedding to Priscilla, who testified as to his own addiction at the hands of Dr. Nick. Stepbrothers David and Ricky Stanley, who told the grand jury of Elvis's addiction, and Dr. Eric Muirhead, chief pathologist at Baptist Hospital in Memphis, who presented the autopsy report to the jurors and told them that Elvis had died of a combination of drugs. The investigators for the state of Tennessee screened all 40 hours of medical board hearings. In addition, they traveled to Los Angeles and Las Vegas, obtaining voluntary testimony from some other Presley intimates, like longtime manager Colonel Tom Parker, and from Linda Thompson, who went with Elvis after his divorce from Priscilla. Last Friday, the grand jury handed down its indictment. It accuses Dr. Nicopolis of unlawfully prescribing prescription drugs to Elvis Presley and to 10 other people, including another legend of rock and roll, Jerry Lee Lewis. In the case of both Jerry Lee and Elvis, there are actually 2 counts in the indictment. District Attorney General Hugh Stanton.
The second count alleges that those 2 individuals were addicted to controlled substances. It names the controlled substances, and it says that he continued to prescribe or did prescribe to them, not in a good faith effort to cure their addiction.
So almost 3 years after the death of Elvis Presley, his longtime personal physician has finally been indicted, in part because of the way he cared for his famous patient. If convicted, Dr. Nicopolis would face between 2 and 10 years in prison for each of the 14 counts. And ABC News has learned that the prosecution feels the case against him is airtight. For instance, in April and again in July of 1977, Dr. Nick's medical bag was reported stolen. After the contents had been taken, the bags were recovered by the police. Before returning the bag to the doctor, the police apparently copied down his schedules for dispensing drugs to Elvis Presley. In other words, from the doctor's own notes, found inside his own medical bag, the state knows exactly what he gave to Elvis and when. Deborah Richardson worked briefly for Dr. Nick. Deborah, was there ever an occasion when you had access to Dr. Nicopolis's office when you saw drugs in there that were earmarked for Graceland? That was Presley's home here in Memphis.
Yes, I went into his office one day, and there was a grocery bag on his desk, you know, about this wide, about this tall. It was on his desk, and a piece of paper was stapled to the bag. It had Graceland went across it, and I looked in it, and it was pharmaceutical samples.
Pharmaceutical samples heading toward Graceland. About how filled was that big grocery bag?
About half full.
Half full of drugs.
Mm-hmm.
The indictment of Dr. Nick is the end of just part of this story. There is still what we call the Elvis cover-up. It is the usual practice in criminal cases like this one for the county medical examiner to assist the state in its presentation to the grand jury. But in the case of Dr. Nick, Jerry T. Francisco, the Shelby County medical examiner, was not even called in as an expert witness. Dr. Francisco, you may recall, is the man who has continued to insist that Elvis Presley died of a heart attack, despite the fact that the doctors who actually performed that autopsy almost 3 years ago have insisted since the beginning that Elvis Presley was apparently the victim of an accidental overdose of prescription medicine. Last summer, 2020 producer Charles Thompson and investigative reporter James Cole filed a lawsuit to force Dr. Francisco to make public the secret Elvis Presley autopsy. We maintain that that autopsy will prove that Elvis Presley died from the interaction of the prescription drugs in his system. Final arguments in that lawsuit will take place tomorrow morning in Memphis.
So if you've never watched this before, you haven't watched it in a long time, let me know what you think. Obviously, you know, this is one of the reasons why people don't like Ginger and they don't like, you know, the Stanley brothers, even though Billy Stanley had nothing to do with this sort of stuff. I don't know back in the day whether you got paid for something like this. Nowadays, and in fact, I'm sure you did because, you know, the National Enquirer would pay people for scoops and for photos. The picture of in Elvis's casket, I think, was $50,000 to one of Elvis's cousins or second cousins to take that picture. Well, let me know what you think. This is Rare Elvis Photos. Hope you enjoyed.